one of the most complex regions in the world today is Latin America. And you are the director of the Latin American Latinx Studies program at Marquette. Can you give us a general sense? This may be a huge question to ask, but can you give us a sort of a brief overview or a sense of how Latin America and Latinx as a region and as a group of people became a field of study in the U.S.? And what do you think are the sort of the central issues that this academic field aims to address?
That is a big question. You're being very daring and asking somebody like me a question like that. But it has a pretty straightforward answer. So Latin American studies, the first thing I'll say is Latin American studies and Latinx studies are two different fields. They're mutually overlapping and complementary. And I think that's probably pretty intuitive why that would be. Latin American studies is a little bit older as an academic field in the United States, and it was really born in the United States in some ways, although you also see some interesting parallels in Latin American itself. But that goes all the way back to maybe the first quarter, but late, getting more towards World War II, the 1930s and 1940s especially. There was this idea of Pan-Americanism. There was a real idea, and especially I say World War II because especially when the whole hemisphere of the Americas was confronted, each individual country was confronted with which side they were going to be on and how they were going to be involved in the World War. There was a real sense of wanting to collaborate and cooperate militarily, internationally, diplomatically, etc. And that then spawned the field of Latin American studies in the United States, which then after World War II, during the Cold War, also was a very important field in the United States. And I think this is actually an interesting part of the history of Latin American studies, because in the Cold War, the United States turned towards more covert actions. We did a lot of military assistance to conservative and right-wing governments and military dictatorships in Latin America, and had a lot of covert actions from the CIA as well. All through that time, Latin American studies was being taught as a field in the United States, and actually worked to kind of challenge some of that foreign policy as well. Latinx studies is based in the United States, and Latinx studies is about people of Latin American descent writ large. We could have interesting discussions, for instance, like a very important group of immigrants in the United States and American citizens, which would be Filipino Americans, kind of belong to Latin America and also belong to Asia. But Latinx studies is about the experience historically and culturally of those people of Latin American descent in the United States. This was born really, some of the earliest programs in universities was around like 1970, late 1960s. It's especially coming out of the Chicano studies movement, which is about Mexican Americans specifically, because Mexican Americans, like African Americans, have been a part of the fabric of this country for such a very long time, and have been a very important Latin American descendant group in this country. So Latinx studies is a little bit younger as a field and is more focused on ethnic studies. It correlates very well at Marquette with our race, ethnic, and indigenous studies program.
What do you think are some of the main issues that Latin American studies and Latinx studies are aim to address generally? I understand they would deal with, right, given the history that you just kind of sketched for us. I would assume that, you know, Latin America seems to have been born out of sort of geopolitical, right, concerns, whereas Latinx, the Latinx program or Latinx programs come out of almost like social movements, grassroots movements in the U.S. What do you think are some of the main central questions that these two fields of study aim to address?
Yeah. For Latin America, I think you've put your finger right on it. Latin America, Latin American studies was very much born out of a kind of geopolitical interest in looking at the hemisphere as an entire hemisphere. And in that way, I think Latin American studies in particular can tell us a lot about those kinds of questions, but now increasingly not just about geopolitical questions, but also and sort of policy questions, but also environmental questions, for example, which nothing that we do doesn't have an effect somewhere else and vice versa. And it helps us have a much bigger perspective, I think, also on some of the same challenges that we face in the United States. Latin America is a great mirror because we were all born in sort of the same moment of the birth of the nation state and the idea of a liberal democratic society. So you start with the US American Revolution, and you have the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution, all sort of happening at the same time. You've got Simon Bolivar down in South America sending people up to communicate and looking at the US model and talking with people in the United States about what kind of constitution he wants to put into place in the northern part of South America. And all these guys were, and women, although most of the political figures were men at the time, were communicating with one another. They all had to face to a greater or lesser extent, the reality of the African Americas, which was incredibly embedded already into the fabric of all of these nascent countries, right? And so when we talk about the development of racism as an idea and racism as it developed in the Americas, it's just a really useful tool to be able to think about it, not just in our own immediate nation state as it's bounded, but in all of these other places that we're confronting the same kinds of questions and embarking on the same sorts of political experiments. That thread is absolutely constant all the way through to the present day. So I find it a really useful tool. For Latinx studies, it's the same thing, right? But I'm going to flip it back a little bit too. It's so joyful. It is so joyful to appreciate and understand the history of people of Latin American descent in this country, which, as I've already said, is incredibly deep and rich. And although Mexico has had a huge imprint, there are many other places that are equally important and have just as rich of a through line in US history and belong to that narrative, as it is to understand all of the cultural and historical richness that they continue to weave into our own national narrative. My life would be so much poorer if I just feel so fortunate that I've been allowed to learn about, celebrate with, enjoy just aesthetically and artistically and in every way possible, enjoy the richness of all of this history and culture that is all around us. We just have to pull it out, I think, a little bit better here in the United States.
Thank you. Thanks so much.